Hello and welcome to The Time of Telling. I'm Mark Walker, and this podcast is based on my unpublished manuscript, The Time of Telling, John Star Cook and the Word of One Tarot. So, John received visitors, Marianne and Axel Warkham, in May 66. He planned a trip to Acapulco with Marianne and the boy. Now, Marianne makes no mention of a visit to John in spring in her memoir. However, she says that she and Axel Warkham visited John in winter 1966. So I've decided to go with John's placement of this visit rather than Marianne's because there are other aspects of Marianne's timeline that appear wrong. Anyway, Leonard and Marianne needed some time apart, and Marianne needed to talk to her dear friend John. Marianne and Axel Warkham had been in Montreal for about 2 years after 2 lonely years on Hydra. Leonard was often away, and Marianne was unhappy. Montreal was no better. She had mentioned to Axel that she was going to see John, and he responded, "Look forward to Mexico, and give my regards to John. Say hello to Leonard and little Axe. Right, and keep in touch. If you could get me a sugar cube with LSD 25, mescaline or something else, or something similar, I'd be more than happy. It appears that my latent psychosis isn't anything more than gigantic hysterical laughter. Then silence, from silence to silence, forever. With regards and blessings, Axel." Marianne's biography relates, when Marianne and Axel Warkham arrived, John greeted them from his wheelchair on the veranda of his beautiful villa on a banana plantation. John and Marianne enjoyed long conversations while Axel played. Marianne expressed her anxiety about how things would turn out between her and Leonard. John tried to impress on her, "There is here and now. Don't think about anything else. Don't run away again." Oh, come here. John had written to Marianne on another occasion to say that to fall in love was a terrible way to express the concept. He preferred to rest in love or to lean onto love. This was because, he explained, people have a fundamental fear of falling. Marianne came to feel that her relationship with Leonard was falling like ashes to the floor. Leonard rang Marianne from New York, and Marianne found it hard to describe her impressions of the place. It seemed so far from modern civilization. Marianne was facing a dead end and was seeking a way out. She was hoping that LSD might show her an easy solution to some of her problems. But after she and John had swallowed the sun, which by the way was a code word John used for LSD, after she and John had swallowed the sun, she felt distress as control slipped away. Her emotions were intensified, and John had to gently guide her through the experience. Marianne tried another LSD session with John, but it too was unsatisfactory. She was forced to realize afterwards that there were no simple solutions, and she never used LSD again. When Marianne and Axel Warkham returned to Leonard in Montreal, they both accepted that their time was coming to an end. From this point on, Leonard and Marianne did not have a permanent relationship. Leonard appeared on television in an interview where he stated that he was going to enter the music industry. He was living at the Chelsea Hotel, meeting folk luminaries such as Judy Collins, Joan Baez, and Bob Dylan. He had become interested in folk music when he understood that he might achieve more success as a singer-songwriter than as a poet. So, Michael Bowen arrived in San Francisco from New York. With Tora, the Great Dane, he seems to have spent the first couple of weeks in San Francisco at the rooming house run by Bill Ham at 1836 Pine Street, the Dog House. Soon, however, he found a suitable place of his own, a studio apartment right in the thick of things at Haight and Masonic. I'll just show you a picture of this place. So anyway, there's Bowen's place at Haight and Masonic. Big Bill Fortner had followed Bowen in relocating to San Francisco, and it seems they wasted no time getting involved in the arts community. Now, there's a photograph of them here, which I'll just quickly find. Look out, Oscar. So here we have Michael Bowen in the white there, and over here is Michael's servant and protector, Big Bill. Now, this is the first meeting of the Artists Liberation Foundation, the ALF. And the ALF was born out of frustration experienced by the San Francisco Mime Troupe, which we've talked about earlier, which had been denied funding given to them in preceding years by the Arts Resources Development Committee in the annual City Arts Grants. So the Mime Troupe gatecrashed a meeting of the committee where they read out a manifesto of their revolutionary aims. The first ALF meeting was held on the 10th of May 66 at the Mime Troupe Studios, and that would be where Bowen and Big Bill were photographed. Trooper Barbara Wall recalled, "Everybody yelled at everybody. There were never more arguments in the same room at the same time. Artists are a hellish lot to get together." Ralph Gleason of the San Francisco Chronicle wrote that the meeting may turn out to be one of the most important events in San Francisco's cultural history. Another meeting was held in late May, by which time Michael had met Alan Cohen, who had recently experienced his famous rainbow newspaper dream. Alan recounts, "One morning in the late spring of 1966, I dreamt that I was flying around the world. When I looked down, I saw people reading a newspaper with rainbows printed on it. In Paris at the Eiffel Tower, in Moscow at Red Square, on Broadway in New York, at the Great Wall of China, everywhere, a rainbow newspaper. I told my companion Laurie about the dream, and she went out for an early walk up the panhandle of Golden Gate Park to Haight Street, telling everyone along the way, artists, writers, musicians, poets, dope dealers, merchants, about the rainbow newspaper. When I went out later on, people were exploding with rainbow newspaper consciousness." So, at the ALF meetings, the idea for a newspaper was discussed. There was a faction who wanted a conventional newspaper but with revolutionary content, and there was another faction who wanted revolutionary content but in a snappier style. Then there was a third faction in favour of more artistic and literary content. The first two factions teamed up with John Brownson, who was appointed the first editor. The paper was to be called the Psychedelphic Oracle. Brownson had come over from New York with a background in commercial publishing and set up a team of volunteers with an intention to broadly reflect the mosaic of countercultural voices emerging in San Francisco. By the end of August, Bronson had the first issue almost completed, when some radicals stole the work and it was redesigned into P.O. Frisco, which soon appeared on the streets as a parody of everyone's ideals. Known as the Renegade Oracle, the cover of P.O. Frisco featured an illustration of a naked girl with a swastika armband, and one of the lead articles was on the joys of masturbation. Michael was nauseated at its stupidity. Everyone was disappointed. We'll just have a quick look at that. So this is the 1991 facsimile edition of the Oracle, and just here is the reproduction of the Renegade Oracle. So this is the one. This is the issue that everyone was disappointed in. Okay, there we have it. As a bit of a side note, Brian Geison's famous recipe for hash brownies makes a mention in the Renegade Oracle, quoting, "A recipe for hashish fudge appears in the Alice B. Toklas cookbook, published in paperback by Doubleday. In addition to commenting that obtaining cannabis may present certain difficulties," Miss Toklas never lived in the Haight-Ashbury, says the article, "she notes that in Morocco it is thought to be good for warding off the common cold in damp weather, and is indeed more effective if taken with large quantities of hot mint tea." Now, of course, it is actually Brian Geison and not Alice B. Toklas making those observations. So John was continuing to receive visitors and to enthusiastically partake of LSD. Mitch came to visit, the first time he had seen John since the dinner at Alice's back in the new year. There are numerous reports of John possessing miraculous powers, that he had healing hands. Mitch tells a tale of a party at John's place. Everyone had taken sacred mushrooms and LSD, but Mitch was having a bad trip. Feeling sorry for himself, he wandered off into the jungle, where he nursed his pain. He then became aware of the intelligence of the members of the vegetable kingdom who surrounded him. The shrubs, trees, and vines could feel his pain. They commiserated with him, but the pain remained. Then Mitch, for some reason, thought that his mental pain would disappear if there was physical pain to take his attention. So Mitch pricked his thumb with a thorn. The thumb throbbed and ached, and he made his way back to the party. He told John what he had done. I would suggest that it was John who approached Mitch. Mitch, correct me if I'm wrong, and asked what was going on. John took Mitch's thumb in his two hands and closed his eyes. Mitch says he was immediately relieved of pain. While Mitch was with John at Hutepec, Leonard Cohen and his friend David Britton came to visit and stayed for about a week. Britton brought with him some sacred mushrooms, which he shared with Mitch. Leonard and John declined to partake. Mitch didn't click with Leonard and found him dour and removed. As Mitch puts it, Cohen was more or less unknown by then, but building up his reputation. John gave a little party for the neighbourhood kids, and Leonard performed for them in John's kitchen, singing Suzanne, among others. This little concert was the first concert for Leonard's songs. Suzanne had originally been a poem published in 1965. Marianne and Axel Wackham were living in Montreal, as was Leonard, who was drinking tea and eating oranges with the recently divorced wife of a friend, Suzanne. Cohen says the chord structure of the song, which he knew would be about Montreal, came before there was a woman's name for the song. Through a mutual friend, he met folk singer Judy Collins, who was initially more interested in his poetry and prose. Judy Collins says that Leonard Cohen sang the song twice to her in person on 2 consecutive days at her home, and that shortly thereafter she recorded the song. Cohen says he sang Suzanne over the telephone to her. After the little concert for the Cuernavaca kids in John's kitchen, Leonard went to New York, and Judy Collins, who recorded Suzanne sometime in 1966, and then went on to encourage his first steps as a performer. He was writer-in-residence at Edmonton University for 5 weeks, beginning the end of November, where he wrote Sisters of Mercy. John continued to use LSD over the summer, achieving remarkable results. Meher Baba had recently given instruction that LSD was not to be used by his followers, and the Richard Alpert chaired meeting in the Haight-Ashbury, where the letter was read out, had occurred, and the discussion was on how to move beyond LSD. John, meanwhile, continued on his merry way. He says, "I took it partly to see if Baba was correct about it or not. I decided he was not in my case." Michael, in the Haight-Ashbury, continued to paint and conduct psychedelic revolutionary activities. He was at Mother's nightclub one night when he met the comedian Dick Gregory. Gregory wanted to try LSD, and so Michael took him to Esalen and administered a large dose. The key point of Gregory's trip came when he saw the beauty of the world and everything in it, except for him. Gregory was unhealthily overweight and became acutely aware of it as never before. The experience changed him, and he became a proponent for fasting and good health. And now Martine enters Michael's life. Martine had been living with Neil Rose in Big Sur. They'd split up, and after another breakup, Martine drove her VW Beetle to San Francisco with no firm plans. Suddenly there was word of a party at an artist's place, and so she went to the Haight-Ashbury. Of course, the party was at Michael's place, and they met and were together from that time. Martine also got to know Roberto, who was one of the main importers of Mexican weed, which Michael helped to sell. Michael and Roberto had been on numerous trips to Mexico together. Roberto had Mexican and Native American bloodlines and had many contacts in Mexico. They arranged at various times to bring back such sought-after produce as Acapulco gold and so on. Roberto was also known as Roberto the Ghost, due to the time he walked straight past police and FBI who had come to arrest him. As they came through the front door, he went out through a window, grabbed some branches, a rake, and a hat, and walked straight through police lines, obviously the gardener. The Haight-Ashbury hip were amassing here and there around the neighbourhood of about 15 city blocks, and as many veterans later reflected, the summer of '66 was the real summer of love. The word hippie was still a year away. there were sufficient numbers of heads for a scene to be happening, but not so many that would make it uncool. The hip crowd were in their 20s and older. The teenagers were not yet there in any great number. Mitch stayed with John until mid-September, making a deep impression, such that John described Mitch to Alice as one of the finest people I know. One day, near the end of his stay, Mitch was sitting beside John and they were meditating. Mitch says that there were people who would get close to John only so that they could take him over, and that John became very suspicious of people in general because of this. John turned to Mitch and said, "Don't ever trust me," which bears some thinking about. And then Mitch returned to the Haight-Ashbury. Bob and Connie were still in India, so he stayed on at the palace at the Panhandle. Rosalind moved in to the palace on the Panhandle with Mitch after being at Stinson Beach. So Mitch and Rosalind are living in the Haight-Ashbury. Michael's living in the Haight-Ashbury. The oracle has begun. The crowds are starting to come together, and everything's coming together, and at around 2 a.m. on Thursday, the 15th of September 1966, an event occurred at 1090 Page Street, which I've called the Haight-Ashbury Defenestration. And it was this event that was like a kind of first domino to the events that followed. So we'll be looking at that in the next episode. But for now, we'll leave it at that. Thank you very much for watching. This is The Time of Telling.